So I thought we'd go ahead and kick off by having our crew introduce themselves and say a little bit about what you did on the movie.
My name is Zack Rago. I originally got involved because I was part of the development of our time-lapse technology, but my proper title is Coral Nerd.
Yes.
I'm Mark Eakin. I'm coordinator of NOAA's Coral Reef Watch in College Park, Maryland. And my role in this is both on screen, but mostly as being chief scientific advisor, one of two chief scientific advisors. Don't want to cheat Ove on that, but where our role was to help guide them on where to put the cameras to be able to capture the events.
And I'm Richard Vevers, and I was the founder of the Ocean Agency, and that's actually me in the picture there with my underwater camera. We've been working, as you said, with Google for about 5 years on the underwater Street View, which was really the thing that led to this project. So it's exciting to be back here. Unfortunately, Netflix decided not to choose me for the topless shot, which is used in all the advertising. That was Zach. So.
Well, thank you all so much for coming to Google today and joining us for an open Q&A. And congratulations, the film is incredible. It's visually absolutely stunning and emotionally just profound. I have to, it left me with chills, and now I'm telling everyone and their cousins and their children to watch it. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I think maybe the first thing that I kind of want to open up with, and I imagine many of the people in this room might have also experienced, I just really didn't know that much about coral. And so if we could just talk a little bit about coral and its significance and role in the ocean.
Do you want to kick off, Zach?
Yeah, I think like the significance of coral in the ocean, like, it comes through in the film, but in order to get to that point, you have to really fall in love with it. And I think you have to, spend that little extra time to really look at them and get the idea that these are animals, that they do have movement, that they fight with each other, that they eat. So I think that's part of the role of corals, is we have to really sit down and look at them and actually, spend a little bit of time ourselves to appreciate how intricate they are, even though they are very basic and very simple. And then you kind of enable the viewers and the audience to really start thinking more critically about what their role is in the bigger picture in a global ecology.
One of the things that I do when I'm explaining corals to people is start with the game 20 questions.
Mm-hmm.
What's the first question? Animal, vegetable, or mineral?
Mm-hmm.
And okay, show of hands. How many think that a coral is an animal? How many think that it's a vegetable? How many think that it's a mineral? Yes, we got one holding. Yeah, there we go. And the answer is all three. And that's what really is what makes them unique and important in this story of understanding coral bleaching, because it's an animal with these microscopic algae living inside their tissues. And the combination of the plant and animal are what build the skeletons that are these huge reefs you can see from space. And so it's the fact that those plants are living inside the animal that leads to coral bleaching. That's the loss of those animals under high temperature stress, which is exactly what we do at Coral Reef Watch. And so, it's really important to understand that concept, but then that also brings to your mind why they're the basis of the food chain, because they are the plants in that area. They are providing the basis of this food chain that supports 500 million people around the world. They're building these reefs that provide shoreline protection and beaches, food from fish, all kinds of things. So, hugely important ecosystem.
Yeah. And this brings me to you, Richard, because this kind of all started with you, I guess 3 years ago, when you approached Jeff Orlowski, he was the producer of Chasing Ice. The ocean has so many different problems, right? We have ocean acidification, plastic islands, agricultural runoff, overfishing. How did you essentially come to this particular issue?
And we debated this a lot with Jeff right at the start, because there are so many issues, but there's a lot of focus on various issues. But for me, this was the one that stood out as being the most significant and the least understood. Mm-hmm. The fact that was the equivalent of rainforest turning white from heat, and people weren't aware of this issue. And it was only going to get worse and worse and worse. And we looked at whether or not we should be telling the story of ocean acidification, which is the other part of the equation when it comes to global warming. But that's like looking at the second tsunami. Let's tackle the first one and keep people focused so that they walk away from this film really understanding a critical part of the overall issue. And for me, ocean warming is the big one for the planet. It's essentially the problem behind climate change. If you think that the oceans control the climate, that's where we should be looking, while really everyone's looking up in the air and wondering what the whole problem is with a 4-degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature. You know, it's very different when you start looking at it in terms of the ocean.
I'm very curious, like, how that process with the production team went to, like, unpack all of those different narratives and dialogues. And I also understood Jeff wasn't really familiar with the issue of coral bleaching either when you started.
Yes, so I mean, I saw his film Chasing Ice, and that was documenting the glaciers changing due to climate change using time-lapse photographers, and a brilliant film. And I saw the comparison between what we were seeing on coral reefs to what he'd previously done. And I thought we were doing a reasonable job in communicating this issue, but it was really seeing that film and the emotion that he managed to generate through that film that I saw a huge potential with Jeff Orlowski being able to do the main storytelling here. And I was very concerned at the start because we met up and I asked him who was his underwater cameraman going to be, and he said, well, I'm going to do it. And yet he wasn't a diver. So he went through this massive learning curve, and we all went through this massive learning curve on this project. But he started looking at it from completely fresh eyes, and I think that's one of the best parts about the film. Is it isn't your usual climate change film. It's not your usual underwater documentary. It's very much a different approach.
Now, what was the process like to actually build that technology and build those time-lapse cameras? Because this was the first time anyone had ever put that technology underwater.
Yeah, on my end, it was, you know, like you just mentioned, we didn't necessarily have bleaching nailed down as the individual thing we were going to look at, but then we began to face what would eventually be one of the largest El Niños to ever hit, and that's kind of affiliated with pushing these corals over that edge much easier now than it was happening 20 years ago. And so we knew that we were racing against the clock, so Jeff reached out to my team, and we basically just had to run with it and not have the ability to do extensive testing because they simply had to be put in the water now, because we didn't know how long this event was going to last. And so basically, we just had to wing it. So I had the technology, the housing that self-cleans and enables us to do this time-lapse. And given a movie that is so cinematic and has this amazing beautiful aspect to it, we had to basically customize the entire interior. So using a Lumix GH4 and just basically completely revamping how it was going to work. So tearing it apart, and then through really just a small Arduino board, a Raspberry Pi, and some relays and a lot of electrical engineering, we forced it to happen.
I think many engineers at Google would appreciate that process.
Yeah, for sure. It was definitely, you know, a lot of work, especially in the beginning, because we had no idea how it was going to look. That's the biggest thing for Jeff, is how are these images actually going to turn out, and how are we going to manipulate that into a time lapse. And so as you see in the film, a lot of it doesn't work out the first round because we made a lot of kind of silly mistakes, mostly just choosing the wrong lens. But it was all just this kind of, that's half the fun, especially in the field, is you're always tweaking things, and you're always just kind of like solving issues on the fly and having to make it happen. So I think that's like the most fun throughout the entire film, is just having to wing it. Let's find out what kind of technology we can build and do it under some pretty intense pressure and largely, you know, like on a boat.
Yeah, yes. So Mark, when did you come in to start advising in terms of the locations that they went?
So actually, even before the film started, I was working with Richard already, because Richard, in the work that he was doing with the XL Catlin Seaview Survey, they had been going out and using this spectacular technology that Richard was behind putting together and doing these underwater street view images, but very quickly the realization with bleaching being a major problem was we need to get back out there and when bleaching's going on, capture that with these cameras. And so I'd been advising Richard and that team already on where bleaching was likely to happen. What happens at the time, it really was a perfect storm. Coming together with the idea of everything that was going on with the underwater cameras, coming in with the idea of doing a documentary, and having that all happen at the time that was the start of what we thought was going to be a huge El Nino that actually wasn't. But it was the next year.
Right.
And that's sort of what led to all of this working out the way it did. Is we had the technology through two sets of things we do at NOAA. One is looking at satellites to look at the sea surface temperatures that cause coral bleaching. So we've got maps, and you can look around on coralreefwatch.noaa.gov, and you can see the maps of where the bleaching's going on or likely to be going on all around the world at any time. And that's great, but the team needed the same thing that a lot of resource managers need. The satellite's great, but they really wanted some lead time.
Right.
What's going to happen in a couple of months? And so, fortunately, we've been involved in an effort to expand this and use climate models so that we predict out to 4 months in advance where bleaching is likely to happen. Now, that's likely to happen. That's not where it is going to happen because there are things like hurricanes that come along and change all of that. So we were involved in providing that information that was guiding them on where to go, when to go, what locations were most likely to see a lot of bleaching, how severe it was going to be, matching that up with information on where it would be photogenic, and figuring out the sort of the planning for all of this. And it wasn't a simple process.
It doesn't sound like it. It also doesn't look like it. Would you kind of walk through actually getting the cameras banked underwater? What was that like? And how did you actually choose that spot? And then I know
we certainly learnt as we went along. The first few were fairly stressful, and yes. You probably can tell a better story of the first couple.
I think the biggest mistake was the first round. Mark's team really provided us with where these cameras were going to go, and then we would head out to those locations and kind of scout. And what's the almost ironic, looking back on it now, is those first 5 cameras in the Northern Hemisphere, we were focused on going down, identifying particular species of corals that we found might be the most likely to bleach, and focusing in on those. So we were doing this in a week, to where you're having to build this structure, basically doing underwater construction. So pneumatic drills underwater, putting it into the sea floor. Then you need all of this weight to keep all of this equipment down there because the cameras are extremely positively buoyant. And then actually making sure that they're working. So you're spending really a week putting them in the water, and then you have a couple hours to say, okay, jump on this computer, make sure the camera's good, and then we would head home, in comparison to learning, hey, maybe we should stick around a little while and make sure that we're safe.
Make sure it's working.
Yeah, so it's a lot of work underwater. So it's I like to joke, we think all of us very rarely get to go on those fun dives because we're always just working.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the end of the day, we learned a lot from the first round, because I think we worked too quickly, and because my team made a mistake in what lens we chose. But the second round was much better, because not only could we put the cameras in the ground, but we could also experiment with a lot of the other technologies that would end up actually making the film happen, which was doing these manual time lapses, and really experimenting with some of the 360 imagery as well.
So in the course of deploying all these cameras, what was it like working with the production team actually filming you?
It was actually filmed over about three and a half years. And after about the first year, you just forgot they were there.
Yeah. Okay.
And you'd wake up in the morning and there'd be a camera right in your face, and it's just, you just get used to it. But it certainly added a new level of logistics, because they had just as much camera equipment to record the event. We had a guy from NASA building a special drone that could take the camera up while we're underwater, at the same time as having the full film team above and below water while you're trying to do all this construction. So just logistically, it was a nightmare.
For some reason, it just makes me think of going through customs at the airport. How terrible that would be.
When we went to Australia, I had 52 check bags.
Oh my goodness. And there's that one, it's pretty early in the film where you're shaving down the case because you're pound over.
Yes. And so we had to do things like develop solar panels that worked underwater because there was no way of powering the cameras. So all this new technology had to be built, and then, yes, of course, it's slightly overweight, so you couldn't have actually taken it, and they had to whittle it all down.
TSA loves those.
Sure.
But one of the things that was the good news for the film, but the bad news for the corals, was how long this event lasted. Mm-hmm. We were under the impression when all of this started that this was going to be like what we'd seen previously. This was potentially going to be a global bleaching event, that it was building up and looking like that. But global bleaching events have typically occurred at the time of an El Nino and have happened within a sort of 12-month window. And so by the time a year had gone by, you're gone. And so the expectation with that first deployment in the Northern Hemisphere was we had already seen bleaching in the Southern Hemisphere at that point, the American Samoa and other areas. We didn't know if it would go back to the Southern Hemisphere. We certainly weren't expecting it to come back to the Northern Hemisphere again. In reality, it was a 3-year-long bleaching event. So from June of 2014 until May of this year, so right at 3 years, we had bleaching going on. And I've had Australian collaborators who say, well, but this wasn't a continuous bleaching event. I said, look, you're looking at it like an ant on a tennis court. Mm. You sit there, nothing's going on. All of a sudden, someone's running around and a ball bounces, and then it stops. And then a little later, it comes back. But if you're in the stands, you know that ball's going back and forth. And that was what was happening with that bleaching event, as the temperature was sloshing back and forth from Northern Hemisphere to Southern Hemisphere over a 3-year time period. So that gave the unexpected second chances because it was coming back again. And the unfortunate thing is at the end of this film, when everything was wrapped and we were premiering at Sundance, there was another bleaching event happening on the Great Barrier Reef just a year after the one that's in the film.
Yeah, it's, I guess, and I want to talk a little bit about, as over the course of putting together the film and doing all the dives, what was the emotional impact for you and your teams, just witnessing that?
I feel my emotion comes across pretty good in the film. It's hard. For me, it's really hard because I got out of college and was thrown into this basically. Mm-hmm. So it's basically like I was just a kid that really had a passion about corals. I'd worked in the aquarium industry for years, and just really it was a hobby for me, and it was what made me happy. And all of a sudden I'm on this project, and then all of a sudden one of the people that are all over the world, and my job is to go document exactly that parish. So that's tough. But that being said, looking back on it now, I don't think I would trade it for the world. And at the end of the day, I don't think I would have rather been anywhere else other than on those reefs, because you always have in the back of your mind that you're doing something bigger, and as frustrating and kind of angry as you can get or be having to do this, you always have it that, hey, you're doing this so that you can show everyone who doesn't have these opportunities to have a relationship with this ecosystem, and allow to share that story to the public in a powerful way, which is extremely important.
Yeah, and Jeff had a big problem with me, I think. Being British, obviously, I couldn't show my emotion. So we were going to see all this devastation, and he'd be asking me and really prodding me, trying to get me to show it. And yes, it was awful. It was very important to bring in that emotion in the film. So I think Jeff did an amazing job.
Thank you.
One of the things that he did for me, and you had already mentioned this, is you really get used to them filming pretty quickly. And I was never under the impression that I was even going to have a role. Like I knew eventually, it's like, oh yeah, like I'll probably be in the film, but I don't think I have a role. But the cameras are rolling 24/7 for the most part. So you're just used to it. And like you are you, like you're just doing your job and I'm out there and like being myself. And so I already had this emotional investment. But it wasn't until the first time I saw an edit of the film after production had wrapped that I had any idea that like I was going to become like a big part of it. So I think that was, I'm really thankful that Jeff did it that way, because I never felt I had to do something that I wasn't comfortable with. I was never like acting or anything. And I never felt that he was like pushing me too hard for those emotions. Like he just kind of had it because he was there and he was filming always. So I'm definitely very appreciative of his team and them kind of almost keeping that secret or just allowing that to happen organically the way that it did.
And you pick up a little bit of it in the scene where I'm first introduced, where we've been watching this event going on all over the world and getting these reports in. And this is one of these things that at first it gets exciting. Because our products, we're really proud of what we do in providing this information out to resource managers, scientists, the public. People are really concerned that we can alert them to what's going on. But then after a while in one of these big events, you start realizing just how much destruction is going on. You start realizing how many people are being affected. You start realizing that people may not want to get an email or a phone call from you because I'm usually coming in with bad news. The U.S. Coral Reef Task Force ended up introducing me when I would do my twice-a-year presentations before the task force as the new presentation from Morose Mark.
Oh.
They decided I wasn't a Debbie Downer, which is where it started, and so one of the chairs came up with Morose Mark. I'm not morose, but I can understand where this came from. But there were days, several days where I would get another email from someplace where we hadn't heard just how bad things were. And it would come in and they'd be providing us with pictures and it's like, this is great. And I start looking at it and I just start feeling sick to my stomach. I just start feeling like, something has just been ripped out of me. And a lot of times I just get up, walk away from the computer, go over, look out the window, come back, take a deep breath, come back and get to it. But, it was doing this over and over a 3-year period, and it was really, really taxing. And this is things that most people don't realize goes on as a part of this sort of activity.
Yeah, there's a great scene in the movie where you've been filming and underwater and then you get on a party boat. I wasn't really sure what that was.
Yeah, I mean, this was, we were in New Caledonia and they were experiencing something called fluorescing. So this is where the corals produce a sunscreen and it's incredibly bright colors. It's highlighty yellow, it's Eve Climb blue against the white. And you jump in the water and it's the most spectacular sight you will ever see. But these are corals which are going through a starvation process and potentially dying. And I don't think anybody really had photographed such fluorescing before. And yet our base was 50 meters away, which was a party boat. And you're having to go and you're hearing all the beats underwater for 6 hours. And then you're going back on top and everyone's just oblivious to what's happening. They would have absolutely no idea that this is one of the most unusual events in nature.
And so thank you for spending 3 years really documenting it and bringing a visualization that I think people can really understand and hold on to. We have about 30 minutes to go, so I'd like to open it up also to audience questions.
All right, so KPFA is our local listeners sponsored radio station, and I listen to them on the way to work every day. And they were talking about these algae blooms that are going on in the Gulf of Mexico, largely due to the meat industry. And I'm wondering, how does that impact corals? And the second part of the question is, what can we do about any of this?
Do you want to answer the first part?
I'll start the first part. most of the time when you're seeing these algae blooms, they're happening in places where there's a lot of productivity, and so they aren't in places where corals are. But there are some places where this has been an issue, and I've in fact seen this where during a particularly strong La Nina, we were getting, well, in fact, after an El Nino as well, we were getting these blooms of red tide, which is very damaging, very disruptive. It not only affects the ecosystem, it affects fish that you might want to harvest from it, shellfish. And in areas where there are a lot of people, it can actually, just the volatile compounds coming off, the toxins coming off of it affect people who are breathing. So, the west coast of Florida, there are times that they have asthma alerts for people because of red tide. And that can damage the corals. So we had these corals in Panama and Costa Rica that some of them had made it through the really warm water in the bleaching event, and then this red tide came in, and the toxins were enough that they were killing off some of the corals. So it's just another piece of that whole puzzle of what the impacts are. The problem with the answer to the second question is there are so many different things. We have to start unpacking it and looking at what do we do about temperatures. Well, the temperature one is easy to understand, harder to implement, and that's the problem of fossil fuels going into the atmosphere. The burning of fossil fuels producing excess carbon dioxide, raising temperatures, that's where the bleaching comes from. That's also where the ocean acidification comes from the excess CO2. But then you have a lot of local effects of nutrient enrichment, of runoff from all the stuff coming down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico and causing these huge algae blooms and causing these dead zones, these hypoxic areas. There's a huge one in the Gulf. But we're seeing the same thing along the Pacific coast. So it's not just a Gulf of Mexico thing. There are hypoxic areas along the Pacific coast from California up to Washington State. There are problems with runoff and some of these things that are going on. We just recently, at the same time that all this bleaching was going on, there was a major die-off of starfish all along the coast here. So, these are different things that are all part of these impacts that we as people are having in a broad range of ways.
And this is why we call him Morose Mark. The journey we went on with the making of this film, it was quite horrific, in terms of what we experienced. And in the last year of filming, we decided, well, we'd actually step back and have a look to see what global solutions there were. I mean, we knew there was a lot of heat coming through the system. And we realized there wasn't really a global plan in place to save coral reefs. And so we had this opportunity of having the best scientists with us. And we decided to come up with a plan, which was a plan called 50 Reefs, which we launched earlier this year. And it's quite a straightforward plan. It's about identifying the coral reefs which are least vulnerable to climate change, because there's huge variation. And then also identifying the reefs which are most important in terms of reseeding other reefs. And Mark is on the Scientific Steering Committee. It's a project that's been funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies, Tiffany & Co Foundation and the Paul G. Allen Philanthropies. And we'll be launching that list of 50 reefs later this year. And that's hopefully going to be a catalyst to bolster marine protection in those areas against the local issues. So really use this as a way of galvanizing support that's required to protect these reefs on a local basis, so that they can ride out the storm of global warming.
Richard, would you maybe unpack some of the issues that you kind of come across when you're working with local communities? Like going into different countries and addressing government versus like the fishermen?
Yeah, and it's very easy to look at this from our position here. Say, right, what we need to do is go into these communities and say, no more fishing, we'll sort out all the runoff, just okay, we need this protected. And that's not the way it works. And a lot of marine protection doesn't work because people rely on those reefs to live. And so what we really need to do is go in, understand those communities, and get it to be based on human pride, an economic model that allows them to still get what they need from these environments, but also just works with those communities. And so that's what we've been trying to do, especially with tools like Google Expeditions and Google Cardboard. We've been going in, recently we went to Palau and went into the local community to speak to fishermen who've been approached by a lot of different conservation organisations saying they can't fish on their reefs anymore. And it's been a huge issue, but we went into those communities and took the Google Cardboard and showed them all the issues and allowed them to go for virtual dives, and instantly they're engaged in conversation. And that was the starting point.
And one of the things also when you're thinking about all of this is looking at different ways you can do this marine protection. The general thought, and it's been increasing, is that many of the fish cover a large area. Some fish are only found on that fish will only live on that reef all its life, but a lot of them are wide-ranging, and so you've got to have a pretty large marine protected area. But that doesn't work unless you have a really large infrastructure. What's worked really well in the Philippines is a patchwork of so many small marine protected areas, and those really work because the local villagers are going from what used to be a destructive practice to becoming the people who are protecting their reefs, who are taking divers out on their reefs, who are, say, managing a giant clam farm, doing things of this sort, and you have this buy-in and a source of income for the local villagers for protecting that. And suddenly you're in a situation where instead of taking things from that ocean, you're actually able to economically be advantaged by protecting the ocean.
Hi. I haven't seen the film yet, but it looks from the illustration and perhaps that most of the discussion is about tropical corals. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, we don't have many tropical corals here exactly. We got a lot of deep water, cold water corals. Does the film discuss this at all? And if it doesn't, could you give us a kind of précis of the state of those corals?
Yeah, there's a very different set of parameters that surround those types of corals. They are corals. In both cases, they're related to each other, but they're completely different suite of organisms, and they live differently. So a lot of the cold water corals also are deep corals in parts of the world. So depending on where you are, you may find those same corals in very deep water in the tropics and at the depth that you can snorkel in Alaska. Of course, I'm not snorkeling in Alaska. But yeah, these are very different sort of corals that are making their living in a different way. They don't have the symbiotic algae most of the time, so you don't have the issues with bleaching. But they are important organisms, and one of the big problems that they've run into is they're slow growing. They are an important part of building habitat on the bottom, and there's been a lot of fishing using trawls and dredges and things that are very destructive to them. So this is one of the things, not far from here in the Monterey Canyon, where they've put in place the protection of those canyons for no trawl fishing, no dredging, so that it protects the bottom to protect those organisms. And that's really been the story on a lot of the deep water and the cold water corals has been more a matter of habitat destruction and trying to stop that.
And actually in Brazil, I just worked with the Google Earth team as well for the Amazon moment where we worked with indigenous communities to help to map the territory. It was an interesting situation because we worked very much with the marketing team. So what I want to hear is from you that came from the advertisement world. How do you see advertisement helping policy issues, right, being reasoned, and how we can help them also to better communicate those very technical and scientific, problems that we've been trying to solve, and we actually are trying to work towards to improve that. Because I used to work for the United Nations as well. It's not the same language,
yeah.
Right? So
yes, and really this is where the whole project came from, was this realization that the oceans are totally out of sight and out of mind. You've got 0.1% of people that ever go diving. So how do you expect any policymakers to really care about these issues? And that was the starting point was, okay, let's reveal the oceans. And in, I think, the first week of us launching Google Oceans, more people went virtual diving than have ever been diving in person. So the tools are there to be able to use the communication skills, and that's only just improving all the time. I think it was a big learning curve for me personally, seeing the power of emotion. And that's kind of storytelling that this film does. And to be able to leverage that, so we're producing sort of 15-minute version of the film for CEOs and for politicians who are obviously short of time, to try and get them engaged with this kind of subject matter. But for me, it's communication and it's technology are the two things that are really going to turn this issue around quickly. Technology has been the bridge that has always allowed people to connect with the ocean. You look at everything from Jules Verne to Jacques Cousteau, they always had technology as that bridge that gets people excited. And that's why it's been so good, you know, working with you guys for such a long period.
So just to reference what Juliana, the project that she was working on, the Earth Outreach team, we recently launched a series of stories in our new version of Earth. It's called I Am Amazon. I highly recommend everyone check it out, but it essentially talks about how we are all connected to the Amazon, whether it's, you know, the lungs of our planet, the water that we drink, the food that we eat. And Chasing Coral is also featured as a Voyager story within our new version of Earth. And we have, I think, 3 other Voyager stories that are live right now. And something that I think a lot about for education is how do we take these stories and then add additional data. So when we're speaking to students, not only are they learning and getting excited about these corals, but then they're becoming their own form of scientists and actually asking questions to dig a little deeper and understand all those, all the different systems that impact our world. And maybe, Zach, would you want to talk a little bit about the work that you've done in education?
So the fun part with the movie, and you know why I think I have so much respect for Jeff and Larissa and their team beyond their amazing skills at making a movie, is that you make a movie and it seems like the end game. You release it at Sundance, hurrah, done deal. But for them, it is you know, taking this and actually cultivating impact on the ground all over the world, and trying to utilize, you know, this piece of art as an engagement tool. So we have a huge impact campaign that I'm part of that team that we're really running with, and a huge portion of that is our educational component. So we're identifying places in the United States in particular right now where we're really focused on saturating those communities that we find are tipping points with the film and with our kind of extra engagement. So for me, I work with kids mostly. I want to get into schools, and so far it's been extremely successful, really based around the cardboards and Google Expeditions. And for me, it's, you know, you walk in and I have the ability to share my own passion with the oceans, and the oceans becomes this vessel of conversation, but it really is about just getting them engaged, allowing them to go explore someplace that they might not have the opportunity in their lives, and then allow that energy to kind of pour into whatever they're interested in. So cultivating their interest in science. I love the notion of make science cool again. So that's where I'm at right now, and that is basically the core of that for me is the virtual reality and Google Expeditions, because that's my in to the kids. No one wants to, you know, have more school. You know, kids don't want more school, but every kid wants to learn. So if you can come to them with something novel and interesting, such as virtual reality, and don't frame it as, you know, a lesson plan, then you actually start to see a lot of motion going on with the youth. And these are the kids that we joke around with this analogy that we've thrown this giant party, and now we're taking volunteers to come clean up the party. That they didn't attend, but instead I think what we need to do is actually, you know, get these kids to throw a better party. So that's kind of, you know, how I'm moving forward, and there's so much more to it with our impact campaign, from hosting screenings to, you know, just actually putting people in Richard's hands to go out and document what's going on in their backyards.
I 100% agree that affecting change is the best solution to fixing the problem and keeping coral alive. On the assumption and historically that humans are slow to change, are there any strategies that we have for extending corals or finding a solution to keep them alive?
Yeah, I mean, there's some efforts, and some of this will happen as a part of 50 Reefs, and a lot of it's happening in other areas where we're looking at the natural ability of corals to adapt. One of the things that our research has shown is that there's good evidence that corals have already been adapting. And in fact, the way our products work is that there's a climatology or a normal temperature condition for each coral reef that's different from other coral reefs. So just like the temperatures here are very different than the temperatures in San Diego, you've got the same thing from one reef to the next. So if you're going out and seeing these corals living at different temperatures, they've obviously had some adaptation over time. And we actually had some warming before bleaching became a problem. And so there was evidence that they were actually keeping up for a while. The problem now is temperatures are rising so much faster than they've ever risen in the past. I mean, anything in the paleoclimatic record, the fossil record, those dramatic changes were slow compared to what we're doing now. And the corals just can't keep up. So one of the other people on the steering committee for the 50 Reefs project, a great scientist who's in the film extensively, Ruth Gates, is doing work to breed supercorals. Now, these aren't genetically modified corals. This is just plain old crossbreeding. They're saying which corals survive a stressful heat event the best, crossing some of those, trying to find the combination that works well, and then doing more work to continue to torment them or train them. Give them those conditions that, just like an athlete, you got to keep culturing and working on those aspects that you want to improve, and they'll do that. And continuing this process and looking to then be able to take those and put them back out in the field. There's some great nursery efforts that are underway, and that whole activity of coral nurseries has been developing. So now the thought of putting out better corals in the coral nurseries and getting them back is one of the great ideas in conservation. But there's a real scaling problem. The bleaching that happened in 2014 to 2017 covered an area about the size of the state of Massachusetts. Actually, it's bigger than Massachusetts. I've got to figure out which state's the best comparison now. But the point is, that's a lot. That's a huge nursery. That's a lot of area to replant. So how do we do that? How do we scale that up? And these are ways to help corals survive so that we're doing what we can to work with them, while at the same time we're dealing with the problem of climate change. Because if we don't cut off that problem, it's just going, you're just going to be putting them back out and having them die again. And that you can't have.
Would you mind maybe going a little bit more into the plans for 50 Reefs next year? And maybe we can think about ways in which Googlers and people around the world can get involved.
Well, for 50 Reefs, we're building up to the big announcement of the 50 Reefs, which will be hopefully around sort of November time this year. And then once we've got that, we've currently got sort of 3 different teams working on this project. We've got the conservation team that is looking at what's working, what's not working, what are the best plans that are regionally based. Then we've got our science team working on, okay, how do we finally get the data that we urgently need on these 50 reef sites and do it at scale quickly. So that means developing new technology. And there's some great teams out there that we're bringing together, like teams at Scripps, University of Queensland, that we can suddenly develop new technology to be able to survey at scale. But then we have the problem of processing that data. That data needs to be open source straight away. We need to be producing reports so that we can act straight away. And we need to be able to visualize that data and show the politicians especially exactly what difference they can make by making tweaks to the local environment, whether it's improving the runoff from the land or improving the fisheries. So these are the tools that we want to be developing, and it's essential that we get engineering support for those. Everything from AI, so the image recognition, deep learning. That's the kind of technology we really need to be embracing now to get the data fast enough to be able to act on. And then the third part of it is the communication. and really embracing the fact that we've got a film out there that's on Netflix, which we couldn't have dreamed of a couple of years ago. And we've got the International Year of the Reef coming up in 2018. If we can't make a difference in International Year of the Reef, then we've lost such an opportunity.
What was like one fun experience that you had on on the trip? Like something that just that brings you a lot of joy, or just was a incredible experience?
Oh, I don't know. I have to think for a moment. If anyone else has
for me,
a good moment.
The whole project, although there was a lot of emotion in it, it was a huge adventure. We were working off super yachts that were taking us to remote locations, diving with sharks which were coming alongside our scooters. It was just a dream to be part of this project, even though we were documenting something that was quite horrendous. And I think that's what's been captured in the film is that's what conservation needs to be about. We need to be engaging people. It can't be about doom and gloom. It needs to be about exciting. It needs to be something people want to get involved in. And that's what we want to be doing next year. I mean, we've already started talking about creating an armada of boats that are already going out to these locations. Let's use them, and let's use them as media opportunities and get people engaged.
Yeah, and I think I would say anybody that I think that's the opportunity to like work underwater and do it frequently. Our job was to watch things die, and for me, it's you sit on the bottom, weigh yourself down, and stare at corals, which I think most people probably get bored of pretty quickly unless you really do love them. But if you spend enough time underwater, you're always running into just amazing things. I mean, from sharks or whales or dolphins, or you just name it. And those are the moments that definitely get like that euphoric feeling where it just kind of everything shuts down, and you just have these kind of personal moments underwater that I'll definitely cherish for the rest of my life, for sure. I said my favorite moment in the film is a jellyfish that's at the beginning. It's got about like 2 seconds of fame, and it is my favorite part of the movie because I can literally, every time I see it, I can just immediately go back to that moment, and just for whatever reason, it was just one of those special days, and it just, everything worked out in that moment, and I love that jellyfish. Like that was just, I'll always remember that moment. It was just one of the most special moments throughout the entire production, was just a jellyfish and how beautiful it was, and the light, and it was just, it was fantastic. So it's the little things.
For me, it was actually at the end of the project, or actually the first end of the project, when this was being premiered at Sundance. And there were a bunch of us there, a number of the scientists were there. And first of all, as scientists, you just don't get this kind of attention. And to have, to stand up in front of an audience of hundreds of people who've just watched a film and have a long-standing ovation for the scientists when they're brought up on stage is like, this is weird. This just doesn't make sense. But Ove Hugelberg, who's in the film and is the other co-chief scientific advisor, he really captured it well at one of those first screenings at Sundance when he said, we write scientific papers, you get it out, you're really excited if 1,000 people read it in the first couple of months. We had thousands of people seeing this and really taking it to heart, feeling it emotionally in the first days this was out, and that was long before Netflix. Mm-hmm. This is a spectacular way of getting it out to everybody. And I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of documentaries, a lot of climate change documentaries, and this is nothing like those. I tell people this is more of an adventure film than it is a documentary. Yeah. There's really a completely different sort of story arc in this than the usual. And it really has that ability to convey and grab people's emotion, get their attention, and make them want to care. And that is huge.
the coral are definitely humanized.
Yeah.
Like,
And that was
that's a huge thing.
Yeah, the journey we all went on in terms of learning, especially me. I started this project loving sharks and the big stuff like divers do, and ended up loving corals more than anything else. And I had no idea about how they worked or what they were at the start. And just meeting the scientists, who are the best in the world, really through this film was just an incredible learning experience and a joy.
okay, well, let's go ahead and give these gentlemen a big applause.
Thank you.